I would like to welcome our two panelists, Professor Mzukisi Qobo, Head of School at the Wits School of Governance, as well as Professor Cheryl Hendricks, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. The topic for this panel is what is the responsibility of Africans and African diaspora in shaping a democratic and equitable international order. The context for the discussion is that owing to various political, social, and economic cleavages throughout our history, Africans and people of African descent have faced a lot of challenges that are both locally specific and globally similar. So this discussion is intended to unpack how Africans and the African diaspora can work together to overcome these challenges and begin formulating a Pan-Africanist approach to international governance and democracy. Before we begin, and before I invite our panelists to speak, I want to highlight that this dialogue is being held in different languages. There's interpretation in French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And if you're looking for interpretation, just go to the globe at the bottom, right at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a globe there which says with the word interpretation. I am aware that Professor Hendricks is being load shedded, so she might battle with connectivity issues, but I thought that we should begin by asking her if she's prepared a presentation, ask her to make her input, and then we can then open up the discussion for more reflections, follow up on the emerging themes and points that will flow from her input and also from the questions that have been prepared for the discussion. Good afternoon, Professor Hendricks, and congratulations on your appointment as the Executive Director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation.
Many thanks for inviting me to this conference and to speak on this panel, and good to be here with old colleagues again. The question, as you indicated, that we're here to deliberate on is what is the responsibility of Africans and the African diaspora in forming a democratic and equitable international order, and more specifically under the headings of economic liberation, climate change, and justice, and an equitable international order. I think that Africans have, since the onset of colonialism, fought for freedom from its shackles, for political and economic liberation, for justice, for equality, for recognition, and for the restoration of human dignity. A fight against inequality and racism, imperialism, and our dehumanization. When we call for an equitable international order, a call that I think remains as relevant today as it did in the days of Bandung, we are highlighting persistent structural or systemic inequalities that continue to negatively impact the advancement of the continent and its people. An international order that remains skewed, that remains undemocratic and unrepresentative. Pan-Africanism was the ideological glue, not only for how we wanted to organize ourselves, but also for our continental aspirations. A relatively simple set of ideas that we should unite, we should show solidarity, strive for collective self-reliance, if we to retain the integrity and inherent dignity and humanity of our people. And that it is only in this way that we will be able to achieve liberation and equality for all, not just ourselves. Simple ideas, but ones that continue, I think, to ring true more than a century later, and ideas that we still find very hard to move beyond rhetoric to actual implementation. Pan-Africanism has always been the key counterpoint to hegemonic development discourses and practices. It has been central to the production of knowledge on Africa by Africans, and it has always advocated for more sustainable ways of governing societies and achieving growth and prosperity. All our important institutions and our frameworks in Africa continue to be anchored in this philosophy of Pan-Africanism. So if you look at the African Union or the Lagos Plan of Action or Agenda 2063, they all aspire to deepen regional integration and to enhance the prosperity, peace, and security of our people to create that shared future. We keep affirming, I think, albeit rhetorically, that we have the collective responsibility to fashion a more democratic, equal, and peaceful global order. So I think the short question to answer to the question that was posed is that we have always believed that we have the responsibility of fashioning out a more democratic and equal international order, because we have been and we continue to be relegated to its periphery. This is what we not only strongly voice in institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, UN Security Council, but that we seek also to challenge the alternative institutions such as IPSA and BRICS. Now, I'm not an economist. I'm going to leave Mzo to most of the input around economic liberation. Safe to say that the pandemic most probably drove home the important lessons that we need to learn around collective self-reliance. Africans had to work together to ensure access to PPE, to vaccines and relief funds, to tide over their populations through long lockdowns. Suddenly, we all looked to the African Union for information and direction, and the CDC actually seemed to come through for us. The pandemic also starkly highlighted the continued inequities between the global South and the global North, and how quickly countries went into logger mentality to protect themselves. This pandemic has impacted all economies, and it has pushed our African economies into recession. It has essentially erased all the gains that were made in the fight against poverty. It has left the scars of high unemployment, of indebtedness. According to the Center for International and Strategic Studies, and I'm quoting, African governments and publics are asking for greater equity in vaccine distribution, more generous debt relief, and targeted investment in key economic sectors. They're now again voicing their dissatisfaction about the unequal treatment in the global community, the harassment of their citizens abroad, and the zero-sum premise of global power competition, quote unquote. There certainly has been, I think, an outpour against the racism that continues to be experienced by Africans in both the North and the East. But we have to move from voicing our dissatisfaction to actual acting. And I think this is where we are at in today's session. The only way I think that we can do this is if we form strong enough regional blocs that cannot be ignored. African countries, I think our first order of business is to ensure that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is indeed implemented so that we can get to having an enabling environment for sustainable, inclusive development. Unfortunately, Africa cannot do this by itself. It needs that cooperation from the West so that they do not actively seek to undermine the African Continental Free Trade Agreement by making their own bilateral arrangements. A West and an East so dependent on African resources for their own survival will not necessarily want to see this African Continental Free Trade agreement being implemented successfully. So even though they might say they support us, we always need to look at the terms of that support. Our responsibility as Africans is to ensure that we work together with the same vision and purpose and methodology to make this work. Simply put, there is no society that has made progress without relying on its own resources, whether that is financial or human, technological, or our leadership, and that is our responsibility. African countries are grappling with severe consequences of climate change, a product not of our own industrialization, but that of the West and East. We are also the least prepared to deal with the situation. We are supposed to be receiving, under the Paris Agreement on climate change, $100 billion from developed countries to address adaptation and climate mitigation. This for a whole continent of 55 countries. Obviously, we cannot rely on this. Again, it is going to be the poorest of the poor that suffer here. Our responsibility as Africans is to ensure that we plan effectively to mitigate the impact of climate change, and that we follow green industrialization strategies, but also that we make the West account for the damage that they have done to the environment that is now impacting on us. That this is not charity, it is not aid, this is reparation as part of a broader reparation package that must be implemented for slavery, for colonialism, and now for climate change. Economic justice demands that African countries reduce the inequalities in their own countries and between themselves and between the North and West. We cannot let the issue, I think, of reparations simply fade. Here we need to be supporting our brothers and sisters in the diaspora who have been leading the charge of reparation. They are no longer that interested in Pan-Africanism, because I think in our hour of greatest need, they were there to support us, but we have not shown the same support to the struggles that they have championed, and we need to come to the party on this. Climate change, the lack of good governance, persistent inequality, exclusion, all also account for the rising violent conflict and continued democratic deficits being experienced in Africa. Climate change is at the heart of many of our local conflicts. Conflicts about land, conflicts about water, typically referred to as farmer and herder conflicts. We are struggling to silence the guns in conflict zones. If you look at the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, Horn of Africa, Eastern Congo, Northern Mozambique, all in experiencing to various degrees conflict challenges. Many of our militaries cannot cope, and so we are being supported by outside missions here. Sudan, as we are speaking right now, in 2019, we were celebrating its liberation. Now we are watching a coup unfold. Coups and attempted coups in Mali, in Guinea, in Central African Republic, Zimbabwe, Chad, it's showing that the coup trend is definitely back. A rise in violent extremism coming way down south as far as Mozambique now, as well as the changing constitutions to stay long in power and a growing number of hybrid democracies. This is a sure indication that our democracies are ill and that our peace and security measures that we have been instituting over the last 2 decades have not been sustainable. We cannot have economic liberation, democracy, or equality, or even project our voice in the global arena under these conditions. So I think it is our responsibility to address these issues because they are largely of our own making. We cannot simply draft plan after plan, agenda after agenda, and not implement the necessary. We have an over-reliance on donor money and outside intervention to pay for peace and security on our continent. African solutions to African problems, local ownership, they become mere words when we do not put our resources behind this. Peace and security is first and foremost our responsibility. The very basis from which we not only enable growth and prosperity in our own societies, but from which we seek to transform that international order, then depends on this. It is our responsibility to develop a new peace agenda on this continent, one centered on human security, and to have that agenda be the one that drives the transformation of an equitable international order, one in which we transform our global governance institutions so that there is not only equitable representation, but so that they are accountable to ensure the needs of all and that they address our growing inequalities. But sadly, we know in Africa that instead of seeing this, we are witnessing a renewed scramble for Africa and its resources. And we as African leadership are complicit in enabling this. And we think short-term about our self-interest and not about the collective well-being of this continent. And so in the midst of finding great wealth generating natural resource deposits in many of our countries. We are seeing increased poverty in precisely those areas where our wealth is located, and a number of foreign countries then coming in to exploit those resources once again. This is not the way we want to integrate into the international order, because it keeps us in very similar situation to that of the colonial and post-colonial eras. One of dependence, one of underdevelopment, one in which we cannot direct the development of our own continent. I think key then for us is to ensure that we have peace and security, democratization, infrastructure development, and a political leadership willing to create the conducive conditions for stability, certainty, transparency, accountability, etc. So by way of conclusion then, it is our responsibility to think through a Pan-Africanism for the 21st century. How can we employ it? How can we rethink it? How can we reinvigorate it so that it assists with answering some of the major questions which we continue to grapple with on this continent, i.e. how to create a more equitable and anti-racist and anti-imperialist international order. We all know that Pan-Africanism has now become state-led in institutions such as the African Union, with leaders in the vanguard that do not care much about its ideals. It has moved from being a people-driven movement to one that got caught up in the bureaucracies that we ourselves set up. And unfortunately, those we put in charge to lead the Pan-African agenda kill that agenda themselves. And we, as Africans and those in the African diaspora, need to reclaim that agenda. We need to develop groundbreaking ideas, policies, and practices that will enable Africa to take a leading role in future global political and economic affairs. And institutions such as WITS, UNISA, IJR, etc. We should be at the forefront of this. We can only do so by relying on our own resources and knowledge, our own experiences and philosophies that we have acquired over centuries. And so I think that the rise of Black Lives Matter movement, students calling for decolonization, large-scale protest movements, and yes, even violent extremism, which offers a different way of belonging, tells us that the need for doing this is now. It is our responsibility to change ourselves simultaneously as we seek to change that international order. So we must therefore consciously work towards a Pan-African network that includes the African diaspora to reclaim Pan-Africanism and reclaim Africa. Thank you very much.
You started on a very spirited and dynamic fashion. A lot of issues and themes emerging out of your presentation. At this point, I would like to invite you, Professor Qobo, to do two things. Firstly, to respond to Professor Hendricks' presentation, if there are any additional points you want to make or any responses you want to make, do so, especially with respect to how the current liberal international order marginalizes the African continent. What do we mean by that? You need to be very clear about and specific about those concepts. Secondly, there's a lot of cynics. We want to chart a positive, forward-looking path for Africa, but there's a lot of cynics and skeptics out there, some of whom have given up on Africa for all sorts of reasons. And they argue that, we want to be active champions of global reform. We want an equitable and democratic international order. But we're not doing the same in our domestic situations. Why do you want change internationally when we're not doing the same domestically? And as Professor Hendricks mentioned, we've seen a great deal of regression in the last few years, especially the last 2 years. We've seen 2 military coups in Mali within 1 year. We've seen a military coup in Guinea. In the last week, there's been a coup in Sudan, which followed another explosion, with the removal of former President al-Bashir. We've also seen some regression in Mozambique and Ethiopia. the president, the prime minister of Ethiopia received a Nobel Peace Prize not long ago, and we're all very happy for him, and we're very proud as the African continent. But the country has been wrecked by violence, conflict between the government and the rebel forces in the northern part. Now, how does one respond to these skeptics' assertion? That it's pointless to ask for change internationally when there is aggression domestically. Professor Qobo?
Thanks, Mills, for the probing questions, and also thank to Cheryl for a great sketch of the global canvas of political and economic issues. So that makes my life a lot easier than it would have been, because she gave us a lot of food for thought on different dimensions. I think one of the points I would like to make is that international relations codify power. So international relations is still marked by power imbalances. And if you look at the multilateral institutions that we have today, these were a creation of the victor countries, the countries that won the World War II, and by and large, these institutions were underwritten by the United States of America as part of what it called liberal internationalism, to promote open markets abroad, to promote international peace and stability, to promote freedom, to promote open commerce. My argument is that liberal internationalism, or the idea that we live in an open global economy, or an open international system that generates opportunities for everyone, an idea that came to its apogee, that that reached its height with the ascendance of President Bill Clinton in the early 1990s, where he popularized the notion of globalization, of human freedoms, open trade, commercial diplomacy, is really truncated, and by that I mean it's never fully blossomed, largely due to interests of those countries that were hegemonic post World War II. And so interests have always led interests have always been, there's always been primacy on interests. That is, the countries that are hegemonic always emphasized their interests. And if you recall, many African countries were still under the colonial grip at the time of the war, and at the end of the war, when these institutions, your General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, your International Monetary Fund, your International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the IMF were created. Many African countries were under the Europe's colonial grip. So, which therefore means that Africa never really featured seriously in the minds of the architects of the system that we lionize today as a liberal internationalist order. So the interests of African countries were at the back burner. So at the time they achieved independence in the late 50s, and many of them in the early to late 60s, early 60s to the mid 1970s. The agenda in these institutions had been had been set, it had been embedded. That is the agenda that reinforce or that that is more aligned with the interests of the US, Europe, and Japan, which was co-opted to this liberal internationalist order post-World War II. So African countries or Africans have always been playing a catch-up in these institutions. So the idea of an equitable global order has always been a mirage up to this point. If you look at some of the points of discussions between broadly the developing countries and the advanced industrial economies, or the so-called the Quad, made up of Canada, the US, the EU, and Australia, and Japan, versus the global South, there has not been much shift in the needle, much shift of the needle. The post-GATT years have not produced any meaningful outcome for for African countries and developing countries broadly. As you and I, Niels, know, the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations that was launched back in November 2001, and the first round to be launched under the World Trade Organization after it was established in 1995 has not concluded up to this point. The round, the last round that was concluded was under GATT, the Uruguay round. So the key tension points remain the special and differential treatment for developing countries, liberalization of agriculture by advanced industrial economies, Europe and the US, dismantling of subsidies, which remain at over 400 billion euros under the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU, and over 100 billion euros go towards emission-generating activities in the agricultural sector, the livestock, land use, fertilizer, all the things that generate high emissions, which is in contrast with the the very same EU's green energy deal. So if you look at the structure of international economic engagements, the African countries or Africa is still at the bottom of the global economic hierarchy. Now, I just want to back that.
Okay, let me interrupt you, Professor Gqobo, just to note that we have quite a bit of ground to cover, and there's a request. Remember, this event is being interpreted for other languages, so there's a request that speakers need to speak slower.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we've covered that theme. It's very clear. I just wanted you to respond to this issue about democratization very, very briefly in Africa, and then we can then move on to the looking forward. So if we're saying, and I'll bring Professor Hendricks after that, if we're saying then we need to reform the international order, there are so many issues and problems that characterize, that define the international order. There are many, many problems. So we've got to be very clear about what are the core issues that are of interest to African countries that we need to prioritize and focus on. So I will ask you and Professor Hendricks to look at that. She's identified very strongly climate change as one of the issues, but there might be other issues which you want to reflect on. So very briefly, how do we respond to the criticisms that we want democracy internationally, but we are not practicing democracy and equitable practices locally? And then let's move on to Professor Hendricks, who can expand on what are the other key issues that we should be focusing on in reforming the international order. But keep it very brief.
I mean, on the international front, I mean, the issues that confront or African countries would be interested in. I've already mentioned one, which is international trade. There are multiple others. I'm not going to go into detail on them, but one of them is finance and debt forgiveness, which is again linked to climate change. That if the advanced industrial economies don't forgive Africa's debts, the fiscal room for maneuver for African countries would remain very limited to undertake adaptation and mitigation strategies. Now, the biggest challenge for me is that international, the Western countries have made many of these promises, from finance for development in Monterey to Glen Eagles, to Doha before that. And now, in the context of climate change in France, that there would be climate finance, it's paltry, it won't serve the purpose. African countries on this question of skeptics, I think skeptics have a point, because if we are to make inroads internationally, we've got to develop our own agency as Africans. And that agency consists of one, democratization. You've mentioned these conflicts or these conflict points, Mills. Even with these conflict points, by the way, the African continent has made important strides in the last 2 decades, because there was a time when you hear of a coup, it was normal. Now we get shocked and we raise an alarm. It's a slow progress, and it's certainly not where we should be. Secondly, is to reform institutions, that is to build inclusive institutions. This is not just a preoccupation of Western scholars such as your Acemoglu and Robinson, but also, Ali Mazrui has written on this. Ngozi Iweala has written on how important institutions are in shaping the pathway for prosperity in the African continent. And then finally, a final point is that if as Africans we continue to elect and tolerate leaders that are not interested in consolidating democracy and that don't have a multi-generational vision, we will move around the circle. So Pan-Africanism will remain a mirage rather than a reality. So we have to have all those critical pillars of agency in place for us as Africans to move forward and for us to be able to challenge the global power structures.
Right. Of course, you're correct when you say that there's been a great deal of progress in Africa over the past few decades. I grew up in the 70s, 1980s, what was described as the lost decade, where there was a predominance of military coups, there was famine in Ethiopia, there were zero growth rates in some countries, there was violence, both intra-conflict between countries, as well as inter-conflict. So there's been a great deal of progress, but I think we also need to accept that there's been regression, as we've indicated. What concerns a lot of people is that, we've had a few military coups and the EU has been very silent, has said very little about those. So that's what concerns people. I think there needs to be more decisiveness in terms of dealing with those incidents. Professor Hendricks, you like to elaborate on that and also perhaps start talking about how Africans and people of African descent can work together in a unified way and fashion common solutions to problems. You did refer to this, but if you could expand on that. You've done a lot of work on the continent. Perhaps you can also speak about the role of the African Union. Do you think the African Union is doing enough to facilitate a Pan-Africanist approach in terms of dealing with these problems? And what is the role, for instance, of countries, the big countries on the continent like South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, what role do they have to play in also promoting that unified approach on the part of Africans and people of African descent in terms of addressing these problems? I know that's a lot to cover, but if you can give us your thoughts on that.
Let me see if I can give a few thoughts on a number of issues being raised. Firstly, I agree that we have made a lot of progress on the continent. Progress primarily in terms of setting up the structures that we need, the architectures that we keep speaking about, and including the policies and implementation mechanisms to go with that. But the actual implementation of those policies have been a bit challenging for us. I want to agree that we cannot be at the forefront of championing reform at the international order when we ourselves cannot adhere to democratic principles, when we are not accountable, when we are still dealing with problems of marginalization, exclusion, instability, etc. ourselves. We have to lead by example, I guess, is what I am saying. And yes, there are a number of military coups that are taking place. That is very disconcerting at the moment. And not only is Europe silent, but we are also being way too silent in a trend that we have seen coming forward, one by these term limits that have been changing over the last decade or so. And so we're moving right back towards authoritarianism. But this deficit in democratization is not only particular to the African continent, it's actually global. And so you see that rise in national chauvinism, in xenophobia, that lack of participation, etc., globally, not just in Africa. I think that in terms of things that need to be done, yes, we need to transform our institutions. We have been saying this for decades now. We need to prioritize human security, as I've indicated. We need to be looking at all of these conditionalities that are still implemented across our continent. We need to look at debt relief. Countries are highly indebted. I don't think that we can say we must prioritize one issue over the other. I.e., do we concentrate on transforming institutions like the UN and the World Bank, etc.? It cannot be a piecemeal approach, I think, to this. We have to look at this more holistically. And moreover, I think that once we are in there, we need to know what it is we want to do with having acquired that particular access as well. It's not enough to knock on the door to simply say we want to be included, greater representation, etc. What is the strategy to bring about a more equitable international order for all? In terms of the role of the African Union here, look, we have been shouting African solutions for African problems since 2002, I think. We in that period, we certainly had our bigger countries. I'm thinking about South Africa, I'm thinking about Senegal and Nigeria, working together to project the African voice into the global arena. That is not necessarily being done at the moment. But I think that our approach shouldn't be one of simply relying on big countries as if we have a homogeneous idea of what it is that needs to be done between the 5 big powers, etc. That strategy may have worked at a particular time when people shared values and principles, etc. It may not necessarily be the best strategy now. We have to see how we bring state and civil society together to project the African voice, but we have to agree on what that voice should be echoing in the first place. Is the AU doing enough? No, it is not doing enough, but it cannot do that by its own. The African Union is simply a collection of African heads of state that are experiencing many of these challenges in their own countries. It's an aggregate of those challenges. In relation to the diaspora itself, and what they should be doing, look, I think we can't simply go on talking about the diaspora as a sixth province and believe that this is still the 1940s and 1950s, that there are some stepchildren out there. They have growth trajectory, philosophies, etc., of their own. They need to be seen to be integrated into our own development agenda, and that there, if we don't get it right to see the interdependence between their development agendas and our development agendas, we are not going to be able to transform this particular international order. So I think that we need to actually be working way more closely with the Caribbean, with South America, see our struggles as one, rather than the trend that seems to be happening is that we run to BRICS and IBSA, etc. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be there, but we have not spent sufficient time connecting, reconnecting, strengthening our relationships with the African diaspora.
Thank you very much, Prof. I would like you to elaborate on that, Prof. Qobo, and there's a question. So the question, there are two questions, one from the chat box, but firstly, just elaborate on how practically, and as Professor Hendricks has said, the AU has not done enough, but this is a state-centric institution, and we cannot rely on the AU to do everything. We need to get civil society involved. We need to get the business sector. We need to get the media. We need to get NGOs and everyone. So practically, how can we do that? That's the first question. The second one is from Ishmael Mkabela, which is, do we need to align ourselves with either the West or East, or for that matter, both of them? What institutions should be approached? Do we need to align ourselves with either the West or East, or for that matter, both of them? What institutions should be approached? Professor Qobo?
Thanks, Mills. Let me start with the AU question. It's an age-old question about African institutions, not just the AU, but also you go to the regional economic communities, the RECs, your SADC, your ECOWAS, your EAC, etc. Invariably, you will find that many of these institutions are not self-sufficient. Their programs are either funded by GIZ, a German development institution, or they are funded by one of other EU's, one of the bilateral development funding from one of the EU countries. So African institutions do not have, in inverted commas, sovereignty. They don't have, they're not self-reliant. So the idea of self-reliant and self-sufficiency is rhetorical, but it's not practiced. I mean, you also see it in the African Development Bank. The countries that are shareholders, the leading shareholders there, in the continent, there really are few of them, your Nigeria and others. But then the biggest, some of the biggest shareholders are your US, it's the Quad, US, Japan, the UK, and various others. So Africans don't take ownership of their own institutions. They don't believe in their own institutions. So there's also another age-old problem, which is too much preoccupation with national agendas. I mean, even if you look at the AU, the new building of the AU was financed by the Chinese. You can't even finance your own house. How will the world really take you differently? Take you seriously. Secondly, is just the self-belief and self-confidence as Africans. Not everything European is good for Africa, or American is good for Africa. So we've got to be able to build cooperation, partnerships, and enter into cooperation with these countries from a position of self-confidence. And that begins at the domestic level, how we build our institutions, how we manage our economy, how we manage our fiscal resources, the domestic resource mobilization. And then you look today at oil-producing countries in the continent, or countries that are reliant on hydrocarbons. They have not, including South Africa, highly coal dependent since the 1922 ESCOM Act, Electricity Act. They have not done much to undertake structural diversification. Now, there are plenty of examples around the world of how countries manage their structural progress over time. And sometimes we just only look at China. But if you look at Norway, for an example, colonized twice, first by Denmark, then by Sweden, a small fishing nation, which only started to industrialize when in the 1950s, they realized hydroelectric power, but on a small scale. And then in the 1970s, when the continental shelf of Norway was discovered, and they mobilized those resources into a sovereign wealth fund. And one of the critical success factors there is not just oil and gas, but a capable public service and the ability to use fiscal resources for multi-generational prosperity anchored on the sovereign wealth fund. So all of that, they say success leaves clues. We have all the clues as Africans on what constitutes success, but we just don't have the courage to remove our leaders or to elect leaders that have the right mindset and to press hard on building democratic and inclusive institutions. So until we do that, multilateral institutions, Africa multilateral institutions such as the AU, will remain what they are because they don't feel pressure from within, that is from below. Yes, on civil society, but also recall that civil society is a Tower of Babel. So they different interests there, and some of the civil society movements are funded from the EU. So their agenda may not really be their own. And I see this in this whole green movement. Business, they can play an important role. You have your Strive Masiwas, you have your Dangotes, you have African business leaders that are enlightened. They're driven by enlightened self-interest. They are invested in the prosperity of this continent. So I think it's important to mobilize and harness those. The diaspora, they want the continent to succeed, but we don't do much to build, as Prof. Hendrik said, to build bridges with our diaspora.
All right, we've got 10 minutes left before we conclude. I would like to ask Professor Hendricks to respond to very, very briefly, keep it crisp and brief, the question by Ishmael Mkabela about whether we should choose between the West and the East or embrace both. There's a big obsession with China on this continent, and some countries and leaders have been very dismissive of Western countries, even though they still do a lot of trade with European countries and receive investment from them and also from the United States. So very briefly, if you could respond to that. And then the next question, which will be the last question as a way of concluding, will be directed to both of you. The Africans and people of African descent, they're faced with many challenges and problems, but it is also true that the African diaspora can be and has been a positive force for development on the continent, through migrant remittances, through trade promotion activities, research, knowledge transfers and all that. So as a way of concluding, could you please elaborate on what else can the African diaspora do to power development in Africa? That should be the last question for both of you, and you can also make your closing remarks as part of this so that we can finish on time.
Thank you. I don't think we should be choosing between an East and a West. I think we need to be setting our own agenda, what it is that we want to be achieving, and whoever comes on board to support that particular agenda is who we go with. There's not the East is right and innocent and all of that. They're both, East and West, have their own agendas. So, how far can we be very clear on what it is and how it is we want to achieve it, and then accept the funds and alliances of those who support that particular agenda? And we need to be very clear on that. I just wanted to also just touch on that civil society, state, etc. issue and how we can do it. We have platforms available. We're speaking here at a conference that I think is looking at also the various Pan-African congresses. Yet when Pan-Africanists want to get together to host such a congress, they can't find any support. Not in funding, not in people who want to go there, etc. We have to get our own house in order and support the kinds of structures and platforms that we have set up for ourselves. And it's not okay to simply say, no, but civil society, they're also fractured, they're also sponsored by all donors, etc. Both our states and civil society are being funded by donors, and this is not a good or a bad thing necessarily. It is that, again, if we allow them to dictate what it is we are doing, then the challenge is there. But I see a different challenge. I see states and I see NGOs and community-based organizations competing with each other in order to get access to donor funding. And that is where the challenge is coming from in our particular societies. I think I began to speak a little bit about the diaspora and how we should really be thinking about the ways in which we reconnect. And what I think would be useful for the diaspora is not necessarily just remittances, etc. They are constituencies in Western countries, in the States, in various European countries, etc. And they can also influence policies and influence direction in those particular countries. But we need to be also in communication to say what it is that they need to be directing. So it's not just about come and you give us funds, etc. It is really a meeting of the minds of how we are going to strategize together in order for both the African diaspora and Africans to change our own conditions and to create this equitable international order that we say we want to.
Right. Professor Qobo, you have 3 minutes before we conclude. Please keep it short as possible. This is
I'll try. I'm timing myself.
A big topic.
No, great question, Mills. Cheryl is right. We should look beyond just remittances. There's a powerful role that the diaspora can play. One is in the realm of ideas, the networks that generate ideas for change, because many African countries have similar problems. And I do participate in various diaspora groups where they talk about, ideas such as how to get manufacturing off the ground in the African continent, how to manage digital transition, how to deal with the climate change related challenges, as well as the related challenges about energy security. So I think there's a dialogue to be had between amongst the diaspora and connecting them to what's happening, the real challenges in the continent. And this is not rocket science, because if you look at the construction of patterns of accumulation in South Africa in particular, back in the 1900s, especially in the first decade to the second decade with Anglo, there was a very strong transnational race elite that involved not just Anglo, but also the Rothschilds, the JP Morgan, and other financing interests in Europe. And what united them is that they were of a white race, and they built a body of ideas about how South Africa and other African countries should be configured. And finally, the final thought, Mills, is that very briefly. Yeah, I mean the other element before the final point is that the diaspora has a very, very powerful role to play in mobilizing venture capital to meet problems in the African continent, problems in the health systems, problems in environment, problems in education, problems in agriculture and rural development. I mean, you can name them. So where there are plenty of problems, there are also plenty of opportunities for venture capital. And some of these concrete strategies are detailed out in a book by Sangu Del, who comes from Ghana, Harvard educated, and undertook field research in 18 African, sorry, I think in about 17 African countries, to look at how venture capital, mobilizing finance from the North to the African continent can really change lives. And then the really, really final point, Niels, is that, if you look at, let me leave it there. The point escaped my mind, but there's so much latent power that lies with the diaspora to start to shift the needle. We can't always be dependent on the West. We can't go to Western capitals with begging heads. It's just that time has got to come to an end, and we've got to speak clearly and confidently to Western countries and say, look, we've got to restructure our engagements and our relationships on a better term. But before we do that, we've got to take ourselves really seriously.
Thank you very much, Professor Qobo, Professor Hendricks, our panelists on the topic, the responsibility of Africans and African diaspora in shaping a democratic and equitable international order. It's been an extremely illuminating, educative, and thoughtful session. I wish we had more time to talk, but this is not within our power. There are people who are in charge of this program, and they want to keep it on track. So that's how we come to the conclusion of our session. And I also like to thank everyone who has been involved and those who asked questions from the audience and made comments. So the announcement that I need to make now is that the next session will start at 4 o'clock sharp, and that session will focus on the topic climate change and African migration. There will be a break from now until 4 o'clock. So it's a short break between now and 4 o'clock. And then they'll be posting in the chat box, our technical, okay, I see now they've posted in the chat box the link to that session that will begin at 4 o'clock. So it's not starting now, it's a break now for 15 minutes, and then it commences at 4 o'clock sharp. Thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon, everybody.